The battlefield was quiet for a moment, as though the galaxy itself held its breath. Smoke coiled from the ruins of shattered habblocks, their steel ribs bent into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The tang of ozone and blood mingled in the air, thick enough that even the enhanced lungs of an Astartes could taste the iron bitterness of slaughter. Ferrus Manus stood amidst the ruin, his black armor glinting with sparks of fire that licked at the wreckage. Forgebreaker, his warhammer, rested at his side, its head still glowing faintly with residual heat. Around him, the warriors of the Iron Hands moved with grim efficiency, machine-like, precise, and utterly silent save for the grinding of armor servos. They needed no words to carry out their father's will. But Ferrus's eyes were not on them. They were fixed instead on his brother. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children moved across the battlefield with a strange, almost balletic grace. His blade swept arcs of silver light, carving down the remnants of the foe with effortless beauty. Each stroke was not merely efficient, it was art. Where the Iron Hand struck to kill, Fulgrim struck to display. His pale features shone in the glow of burning cities, and his lips curved with something too close to satisfaction. Ferrus felt his chest tighten, though he could not say why. This was not the first time he had fought beside Fulgrim, nor the first time he had witnessed the perfection of his swordplay. But something was different. Subtle, yet undeniable. Each movement carried a calculated flourish, a self-awareness that seemed to demand an audience. Once, Fulgrim had fought to inspire his warriors, to embody the Emperor's vision of nobility. Now, Ferrus feared, he fought to glorify himself. The Iron Hands pressed forward, their bolters thundering in unison. But the Emperor's children advanced in a different cadence, less disciplined, more theatrical. Their cries of exultation rose above the roar of battle, their voices singing praises to Fulgrim as though he were not simply their primarch, but a god of war incarnate. Ferrus's vox crackled. "Brother," Fulgrim's voice rang, smooth and elegant, "see how they fall before us. The enemy is broken, there will shatter beneath our combined strength. A beautiful sight, is it not?" Ferrus grunted, the sound low and noncommittal. "They fall because they are weak. Nothing more." There was a pause, too long, too deliberate, before Fulgrim laughed softly. "Ah, Ferrus. Ever the pragmatist. You see only the function of the strike, never the artistry within it. The dead care little for artistry." Ferrus's reply was curt, but his grip on Forgebreaker tightened imperceptibly. It was not the first time such words had passed between them. Their differences had always been there, Fulgrim's obsession with perfection, Ferrus's devotion to strength. But now, standing amidst the ruin of a conquered city, those differences seemed sharper, like the first cracks in a flawless blade. As the last pockets of resistance were crushed, Fulgrim gathered his captains. He stood on the steps of a ruined cathedral, its once holy spire shattered, and addressed his warriors with a speech laced in honey. "My brothers," he cried, his voice carrying across the battlefield with unnatural resonance. "Witness the glory we have wrought. The perfection of our strike, the beauty of our unity. The Emperor himself must look upon this day and smile." The Emperor's children roared in response, their cheers echoing like a choir in worship. Ferrus watched in silence, his expression hard as iron. Something in Fulgrim's words gnawed at him, not their meaning, but their intent. He spoke less of the Imperium, less of their father, and more of himself. The cathedral behind him, once a symbol of devotion to a local faith, now seemed to frame him as if he were its new deity. The thought unsettled Ferrus. That night, amidst the cooling ash of victory, Ferrus withdrew to a ruined forge. He sat upon a block of stone, the faint glow of molten metal casting light across his scarred features. His warriors rested in silence around him, some repairing armor, others sharpening blades. They asked no questions of their primarch, their loyalty was absolute. Yet Ferrus's mind was not still. He remembered another forge, long ago on Terra, where he and Fulgrim had once labored side by side. The air had been thick with smoke and the scent of molten iron, and their laughter had echoed as two brothers competed not for glory, but for the joy of creation. Fulgrim had crafted the fire blade, its edge flawless, a weapon of elegance. Ferrus had forged Forgebreaker, his warhammer, brutal and unyielding. Different philosophies, yet united in purpose. Two sides of the same coin. Ferrus remembered how Fulgrim's eyes had shone with pride, not for himself, but for the bond they shared. He remembered how their father had praised them both, declaring their weapons symbols of their brotherhood. That memory burned brighter than the forge fire before him. But now, it felt distant. Fragile. Like a dream fading in the morning light. The next day, battle was joined once more. The foe, driven to desperation, hurled their remaining forces against the Imperial armies in a final, frenzied assault. Ferrus led from the front, his hammer crushing enemy lines with unstoppable force. The iron hands advanced behind him, methodical and relentless. Yet even as he fought, his gaze strayed to Fulgrim. His brother moved like a dancer, his armor gleaming unnaturally bright despite the grime of battle. The fire blade sang in his hands, its edge drinking deep of blood. But there was something in his eyes, an intensity, a hunger, that Ferrus had never seen before. And when the last foe fell, Fulgrim did not stop. He struck again, and again, long after the enemy lay dead at his feet. His warriors cheered him, but Ferrus felt only unease. When the fighting ended, the two brothers stood amidst the corpses. "You killed him twice over," Ferrus said flatly, nodding to the broken body at Fulgrim's feet. Fulgrim turned, his smile cold and distant. "Perfection, Ferrus, lies not in sufficiency, but in transcendence. To strike beyond necessity, that is art." Ferrus's eyes darkened. "Perfection is meaningless if it serves only yourself." For a moment, silence hung between them. The ash fell like snow, and the fires crackled low. Fulgrim's expression softened, though only slightly. "Perhaps," he murmured, his voice almost wistful. "But tell me, brother, have you never wanted more than mere strength? More than survival? Have you never wanted to create something eternal?" Ferrus looked at him, and for the first time, felt the weight of doubt settle in his chest. That night, as the two legions prepared to move on, Ferrus remained awake, standing alone beneath a fractured moon. The silence pressed heavily around him, broken only by the distant murmur of Emperor's children revelries. He thought of Fulgrim's smile, his words, his unnatural grace upon the battlefield. And for the first time in all their years together, Ferrus asked himself a question he had never dared to consider: what if my brother is no longer the man I knew? The seed of doubt had been planted. In the following days the campaign pressed on, taking them from ash-choked cities to blasted plains where lightning arced like the fingers of a dying god. The duo of legions, Iron Hands and Emperor's Children, formed a lethal complement in strategy and spectacle. Where Ferrus's tactics were blunt instruments of pressure and attrition, Fulgrim's maneuvers were elegant enforcements of theater, flanking movements timed like cadences, feints that bled the enemy of purpose, sudden storms of precision that left nothing but carved statues of the fallen. Yet with every engagement Fulgrim's manner grew more deliberate, as if each kill were a stroke in a private mural only he might ever see. He began to speak in new ways, not to commanders about formations and logistics, but to artists and poets who somehow followed the Emperor's children like court sycophants. He framed the campaign not as obligation to the Imperium's security but as an exhibition of perfect conflict. His dispatches included descriptions of light upon blade and the curve of a skull split in a certain way that hinted at an aesthetic sensibility Ferrus had never wished to read into war. The Iron Hands took no pleasure in poetry. They measured victory in returned banners and the silence of the enemy, and Ferrus prized these measures like a smith prizes balance in alloy. He was not blind to Fulgrim's talent for morale and spectacle, yet the increasing flattery directed at his brother, gilded paintings, staged tableaus on conquered plates, gnawed at him. The difference between pride and vanity is a narrow one, Ferrus thought, and he watched to see which way Fulgrim would lean. One evening, after another bloody skirmish, Fulgrim summoned Ferrus to a ruined amphitheater that had once echoed with the songs of an extinct culture. Torches had been set in stately rows, and in their light the emperor's children had arranged a display, rows of enemy trophies, banners neatly folded, faces of fallen foes cleaned and displayed like mirrors. Musicians, recruited from the conquered world, played a dirge that had been rewritten as an ode to Fulgrim's victories. "You should see it," Fulgrim said when Ferris arrived, his voice a melody in the torchlight. "We shape memory, brother. We give the galaxy stories it can carry forward. There is not only victory, there is meaning." Ferris stepped between the ranks, the smell of sweat and polished metal filling his nostrils. He could not deny the effect. The display moved men, made them glamorize what had been brutal and ugly. But the display was arranged to place Fulgrim at its center, the light converged upon him, the banners seemed to point like a chorus to a single voice. "You would make war into theater," Ferris said. "And what then? Will the enemy kneel to applause?" Fulgrim's face softened. "Do not be so literal, brother. There is truth in beauty. Consider Forgebreaker, its weight is not only for meeting armor, the angle of its head, the balance of its haft, these are considerations that make it an extension of you. The Fireblade sings not because it kills, but because it is true to its maker's soul." Ferris felt a coldness at the base of his skull. "Do not speak as though weapons are idols," he said. "Idols are only objects which men place meaning upon," Fulgrim replied. "Do you not sometimes feel," he paused, searching Ferris's face. "Do you not sometimes long to craft, not merely to break?" Ferris imagined their designs back on Terra, each hammer bent to crush weakness, each sword honed to a razor for a clean, efficient death. Craft was never absent from Ferris's life, but it had always been a tool toward an end. The notion of seeking meaning beyond the end unsettled him. He had seen men lose themselves in ornamentation before, it led to distraction, and distraction to failure. The memory of a battalion who had faltered over ornate plating at a crucial moment haunted him, their faces still in his mind like the ghosts in the ruined amphitheater. "Creation without purpose is vanity," Ferris said finally. Fulgrim smiled then, and for a moment the old warmth, his brother's old charm, flickered into being. "Perhaps vanity, yes. But even vanity may teach us something of the heart." Ferris left with the phrase lodged like a splinter. He would not be seduced by style. He would not become a man who measured himself by the gaslighting of his own reflection. Yet as night folded over the camp, he found his memory drifting to a different image, not the amphitheater, but a quiet workshop on an early morning, when Fulgrim had once used a whetstone with solemn intensity, humming a tune that had no lyrics. The recollection was small, an ember of a more innocent age. He found himself holding it and listening to the little song like a man who had touched a memory he feared to lose. The campaign continued. In a valley blackened by acid rain, the two primarchs argued strategy. A column of refugees had been found, survivors of a cult whose faith had been intended for annihilation by the Imperium. Fulgrim advocated sparing them, integrating the artistic remnants into the tapestry of retold victory. Ferris demanded they be processed, their information sifted for threats and then, if no clear danger, detained and relocated. The discussion was not long, but it was telling. "We cannot bind ourselves to every sob story," Ferris said. "We are instruments of the Emperor's will. Our duty is to secure, not to curate." Fulgrim's eyes flashed. "We are also keepers of what will endure. The stories we leave behind, do not tell me they are meaningless." "You put stories above order," Ferris answered. "You place memory at the center and call it purpose. That is not the way of iron." Fulgrim's voice dropped to an intimate tone. "You think in absolutes, Ferris. Strength is not merely the blunt force of iron, strength may be the courage to make the galaxy hold its breath for a moment, to see the beauty within brutal truth." The argument ended with neither man yielding an inch. Later, as Ferris walked the perimeter of the camp, he watched the Emperor's children hold a ceremony around a bonfire. Fulgrim stood in the center with a helmet tucked beneath his arm, and he spoke softly to his legion, not of tactics but of excellence, of the necessity to be refined, precise, worthy of being remembered. The words reached Ferris like embers. He found himself stepping closer until the scent of wine and perfumed oils reached him, faint and foreign within the smoke of war. He remembered then a conversation from longer past, a tribunal on a moon called Medusa, where, before the Great Crusade bent the galaxy into new shapes, they had both stood with other primarchs and debated the Empire's future. Ferrus had argued for systems hardened like armor, clear policy, unflinching enforcement. Fulgrim had argued for an imperium that inspired, states that produced art and refinement as bulwarks against barbarism. The debate had been fiery, their faces close, their words sharpened. Yet afterward they had shared a bench and laughed until dawn, agreeing that perhaps both truths could be married. Now, years later, Ferrus could not help but notice that Fulgrim's rhetoric had shifted from a balance between utility and beauty to an insistence upon beauty as a destiny. He had begun to surround himself with artisans who praised him not simply for victories but for the curations he encouraged. He had begun to test his captains less on their endurance than on their flair. Men were given rewards for the way they posed upon the battlefield, not for how quickly they returned the line. Small things, Ferrus told himself. Insignificant. But accumulation is the nature of corrosion. One rusted rivet can loosen an entire hull. He could accept some difference, he had always accepted his brother's vanity as a foil to his own functionalism. But the pattern bothered him. If Fulgrim's pursuit were aesthetic at the cost of efficiency, if he elevated personal perfection above the hardened laws of warfare, then his choices could cost lives. Ferrus had no patience for choices that wasted men. A fortnight after the amphitheater, they were ordered to secure a manufactorum that produced shield plating for frontier worlds. Intelligence suggested the facility had been sabotaged, crews were missing. Ferrus motioned for a methodical search and sweep. Fulgrim suggested a different approach, a staged entry, theatrical surprise, designed to unnerve the saboteurs and draw them into an elegant trap. Both approaches had merit. The choice should have been simple, combine them. But the tension between their styles had become a standing friction. They presented a united front in execution, but Fulgrim's plan, though glittering, hinged on precise timing and showmanship. Ferrus found himself watching the operation as if it were an experiment to test a hypothesis. Would art hold under the pressure of necessity? At the moment of execution, something went wrong. A detonator, hidden like a piece of jewelry, ruptured the carefully choreographed maneuver. Lives were lost. Men screamed. Fulgrim's expression flickered, something like guilt, but within moments he was already reconfiguring the tableau, shaping the aftermath into a story of triumph over adversity. He ordered his ministrations, sewn into the narrative of glory, and his men followed like actors taking direction. Ferrus did not find the solace in a constructed victory that Fulgrim seemed to. He found only a hollow space where order should have been. The manufactorum still lay wrecked. Surrogate poets later praised Fulgrim's quick thinking. Ferrus withheld words. He felt heat behind his eyes, not anger in the way of combat, but a hot, dull grief for men gone because someone had chosen drama over prudence. In the quiet that followed, Ferrus sought the simple truths he had always clung to, a hammer balanced for the arm, a shield that would hold, the eye that could judge steel for what it is. He revisited, in memory, the bench on Terra where he and Fulgrim had once traded jests over the anvil. He remembered the weight of Forgebreaker in his hands, how it felt like a part of his arm. He thought about the symbolic fracture between hammer and blade, that tools can become talismans when the maker forgets their original purpose. He did not hate Fulgrim. He could not afford hate, hate is wasteful and messy. But doubt had a way of rooting itself in small slights, in the tilt of a head, the cadence of a speech. Ferrus found himself watching Fulgrim not as a brother but under a microscope, searching for anomalies, searching for reasons to dismiss his discomfort. The mind is adept at both comfort and inventing stories. Ferrus had to guard against the latter. He feared that if he allowed suspicion to grow, it would become vindictive, and vindication would not heal the wounds of men. And yet the pattern continued. Fulgrim's interest in the arcane and exotic deepened. He began to keep odd talismans, small things of bone and polished glass gathered from conquered cultures, treasures that shimmered with a strange luminescence in the night. He spoke of transcendence and perfection in ways that sounded like prayers. He began to prefer the company of certain philosophers and sculptors, men whose eyes shone with a light like Fulgrim's. These men were small at first, annexed as counsel, then as confidants, then as curators of his taste. By the time they were hosting exhibitions in conquered plazas, it seemed to Ferris that those around Fulgrim were not there to help rule but to help rehearse adoration. It was during one chill dawn, with dew like silver across the broken banners, that Ferris walked into Fulgrim's tent unannounced. He found his brother at a small table, alone, studying a strip of mirrored glass. The light from a single lamp crawled over Fulgrim's brow, catching the plane of his cheekbones. "You move among baubles," Ferris said without preface. Fulgrim's hand stilled. He did not startle, he could not be surprised. "We are what we make ourselves into," he answered. "And sometimes we discover what we are through what we keep." Ferris crossed his arms. "Do you keep these to remember, or to be remembered?" Fulgrim looked up, and for an instant the smile was gone. There was, beneath the surface, a fatigue that made him look almost human, less a sculpted ideal than a man bearing 1,000 unseen cuttings. He set the glass down and met Ferris's gaze. "Perhaps both," he said softly. "Do you not think you have ever wanted to be remembered, brother? To leave something of yourself that outlasts the brittle years of war?" Ferris opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I will be remembered for what I do. I do not need courtiers or relics." Fulgrim nodded. His hands trembled the slightest degree, but he masked it quickly, as a butcher masks the tremor of the blade. "I know your mind, Ferris. I know its iron logic. But I do not think you see that to make the galaxy better is more than to subdue it. It is also to inspire its hearts." They sat in silence a long while. Ferris watched Fulgrim, searching for the point where the old man's warmth had transformed into something else. He found only a man with eyes that had grown intolerant of ordinary measures and a hunger for something, he was not certain what, that seemed to push him beyond the borders of brotherhood. When he left, Ferris felt the seed of doubt take root a little deeper. It was nourished by the small things, the way Fulgrim's captains polished their helmets to glossy perfection, the praises sung by poets, the trophies arranged as if on altars. He was a man born of iron, and these were manifestations of a different element, glass, mirror, image. They spoke of self-reflection, they begged to be looked upon. In war, appearances can be a kind of deception as lethal as any mine. Ferris thought of that often now. He thought of the liar's blade, an artifact whispered of in other campaigns, a sword whose edge could distort truth. He had not yet seen it, the words themselves had been enough to put an image into his head, a blade that altered perception, a temptation for a mind that already preferred artifice. The notion irritated him. Names have power, and even in idle myth a name could plant a thought, a suspicion. So when Fulgrim's conduct grew stranger, when he lingered over objects of unknown origin, when he smiled in a way that suggested a visitor from another place had been welcomed into his heart, Ferris's vigilance hardened. He would not pry into dreams unnecessarily, but he would not allow a brother to become a hazard to the men who had sworn their lives to them both. If there was a choice to be made, between confronting now or watching and gathering evidence, Ferris knew his nature. He would watch. He would calibrate and measure until the suspicion either broke into proof or withered under the weight of rational explanation. The seed of doubt was a living thing now, it could be nurtured by neglect or drowned by truth. Ferris planted the thought like a sentinel at the edge of his mind and resolved he would not sleep until he knew whether it was treachery taking root or merely a new facet of a man he had always loved. The campaign ground on. The landscapes changed but the patterns did not. Fulgrim grew more luminous in his theatrics, more seductive in his arguments for beauty as destiny. Ferris grew quieter, his thoughts turning inward like a machine recharging. On a night when the sky itself seemed to curl inward, Ferris sat and listened to the faint strains of a lament that had been rewritten into a paean for Fulgrim's victories. He felt the pulls of memory, their laughter at a bench on Terra, the battle-hardened compassion of men who had shared flames and iron. He also felt a new, colder certainty, the man he had known might be unraveling, not into a new being of nobler form, but into something dangerous and self-adoring. He did not know yet what lay beyond the seed, only that doubt was planted and that it would grow into one of two things, a proof that would require action, or a nightmare that would break him if he let it. He steeled himself not to become a man broken by fear. He thought of Forgebreaker, its balance, the way it returned to his hands as if they had been made for it. He thought of the fire blade, how it sang in Fulgrim's hands. He thought of brotherhood. He thought, and the seed of doubt lodged deeper, patient and cold as winter. The moon that night was a sliver of silver clipped behind a veil of cloud, it made the world look like a thing half-remembered. Morning had no authority there, only a long, bruised dawn that smeared light across the broken horizon. Ferrus Manus walked through the camp, his steps quiet but heavy, as though each footfall left an impression on the ground that memory would not soon erase. The iron hands slept in rigid rows, their armor lay like dark shells beneath them. The Emperor's children were louder, of course, voices weaving laughter and low conversation, the clink of chalices, the soft brush of hands over fabrics and instruments brought from a dozen worlds. Wherever he went, Fulgrim's influence had altered the camp's soundscape, not merely the call to arms but the placement of pillows, the careful folding of banners, the way a brazier's flame was allowed to lick the air in a certain pattern. He found Fulgrim alone, as if by design, seated at the edge of a reflecting basin that had once been ornamental and now held a thin sheen of rain. The basin mirrored the sky, and in it Ferrus saw not only the slender face of his brother but clouds that moved like slow smoke. Fulgrim's reflection was too precise, as though it had been drawn with a hand that loved detail. A strip of cloth, a ribbon of polished metal, and beside it a small, dark object lay, a blade no longer than a dagger, its surface black as a cesspool and yet catching light in wicked, misleading increments. Farmers' myths and soldiers' tales had names for blades that whispered, cultured men had names for artifacts that made a mind sing. Ferrus did not know the name for this thing then. He only knew his mouth tasted of iron. "You are up early," Fulgrim said without looking away from the pool. The words were soft but there was an undercurrent, like a chord under a melody. "I walk," Ferrus replied. "I listen." Fulgrim's hand brushed the black blade. The motion was casual, intimate, as if it were a lover's touch. For an instant the little world of sand and water and polished metal seemed to vibrate, the reflection in the basin shimmered, and the clouds shifted in a way that was not natural. Ferrus watched the play of light and felt a prickle at the base of his neck, the same uneasy awareness that accompanies the approach of a storm. "You should join us tonight," Fulgrim said. "There is a recital. It would please me to have you there." "I have no taste for recitals," Ferrus said. "Nor for entertainments that dress war in song." Fulgrim's fingers tightened around the hilt of the dark blade. "You mistake me, brother. I do not dress war in song. I dress men in the recognition of what they can be. Today we kill, tomorrow the telling begins. The telling is as important as the kill." The basin's surface disturbed again. For a moment Ferrus thought he saw not just cloud but a flicker, an image of him in a forge, younger, laughter in his mouth and sweat on his brow, then another image next to it, Fulgrim, hands poised over the fire blade as if coaxing a tone from it. The basin's reflection slurred like paint upon water and the images drifted away. Ferrus blinked and they were gone. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the black thing. Fulgrim smiled without humor. "An instrument of discernment," he said. "A means to peel back the layer of mere surface and peer into what truth looks like. It has many names among those who collected it, the lyre, the mirror of truth, the truth-bane. Names are for those who wish to own things by labeling them. We will call it what it is." "You call it truth and it is named lyre," Ferrus answered. Fulgrim's eyes were bright. "Then perhaps it will teach you to recognize the difference." They argued then, as they had argued in other places about other things, words like steel against steel. But this argument gnawed at Ferrus because while it was an argument on the surface, there was something below it, Fulgrim's hand resting possessively on the warped hilt, the subtle rise in his voice when he spoke of the object, the way his expression registered something like hunger. The lyre blade, Fulgrim said, was a relic of a city that had sank under its own lights. He told tales of artisans who had carved beauty until the world broke. He spoke of a craftsman who had tried to make a perfect edge for the soul. Legends gathered about such things like rot around a wound. The thing itself seemed small, it fit in the palm of a man, and yet it exuded a patience that Ferris found intolerable. "You do not trust it?" Fulgrim asked, reading his face. "I trust no object that promises revelations," Ferris said. "Revelations have servants, folly and ruin. The tools we make must be subject to us, not the masters of our fate." Fulgrim's hand tightened. "You speak of tools as though they were instruments only of force. But they are also extensions of the spirit. Imagine if your hammer could not only deliver force but also teach you what weakness feels like, what it cannot withstand. Would you refuse to learn?" Ferris could have said then that no instrument should be allowed to tutor the mind, tools were matters of balance and physics. But he looked at his brother and saw not merely an intellectual curiosity. He saw a man who lingered too long over a thing, who chased sensation where once he had sought principle. He had watched the change unfold in increments that seemed almost insignificant until they formed a whole, Fulgrim's taste for adornment, his gatherings of philosophers and artists, his preference for staged glory. The lyre lay at the center of the moving circle now, coaxing and flattering like a sycophant. "You will keep it," Ferris said at last. "You will let it sit and learn no more than a blade should." Fulgrim shook his head. "You cannot be the judge of my heart, Ferris. I will keep what I wish." So the blade remained. It was small, and for a time it was a toy, a curiosity in a camp where curiosities would not have been out of place. Men who moved in Fulgrim's orbit learned to look a certain way at certain things. If one looked too long, the blade seemed to look back, and in looking back it did something to the face of the looker, a softening, a slight widening of the pupils, a slow alignment of thought to the current of the object. Events grew more complicated when they returned to a system where whispers of other things had already spread. The warp was a continent of temptation in that war, isolation had always been its friend. Fulgrim's artists found relics and trinkets in the ruins they took as trophies. Among them arrived strangers who seemed to know how to speak to the blade. They were subtle men, silk-tongued, patient. They called themselves curators and philosophers, and they asked to be allowed to show their work. Fulgrim, with a smile like a blade edge reflecting the sun, welcomed them. Ferris watched them with the wariness of one who knows how easily men can turn a noble cause into a plaything. At the front the fighting changed too. Where previously Fulgrim had fought with an elegance that elevated the sword to an instrument of command, now his methods turned sharp and particular in a new way. He began to add a cruelty to his theater. He would force an enemy to watch while he demonstrated the anatomy of a defeat, not merely to kill quickly but to make the slaughter an education on form and sensation. That the victims were living, writhing things was no longer an impediment. The effect upon his captains was immediate, many responded with zeal. They began to emulate the Primarch's sensual brutality, hooks and webs that tore flesh with rhythm, incapacitations staged like dances where the final step was the extinguishing of light. Ferris's breath, when he saw these things, tasted like dust. One battle, an assault on a fortress carved into a cliff face, remained in his mind like a wound. The Emperor's children had found the fortress's defenders holed in labyrinthine halls. Fulgrim insisted on a method that seemed at first to be an artful siege: illuminate corridors with mirrors, use sound to unsettle, coax the defenders into a chamber where their response would be orchestrated. The lyre blade, kept sheathed at Fulgrim's waist, pulsed faintly in the torchlight, as if aware and applauding. When the trap closed, the defenders were not simply cut down. They were given a performance, the slow lowering of arms, the ritual of humiliation, the final stripping away of identity in a way meant to make their end into an object lesson. The method worked, the fortress fell. Fulgrim's captains cheered. Yet Ferris, standing on a parapet and feeling the cold jut of stone beneath his boots, recognized in the method something beyond theater. It was ritualized contempt. It treated a man as an object to be shaped, not as a sentient being with a life that mattered for itself. He remembered the forges of Terra, the hammering of iron in the early hours, the smell of scale and sweat. He could not reconcile that rhythm with what he had seen. Tools must serve purpose and not become masters. If a man could be manipulated, then he could be broken. If a man could be broken into an example, then a people could be broken into spectacle. The lyre did not just reveal truth, it seemed to teach the danger of believing one's reflection. Ferrus confronted Fulgrim after that battle, under a sky roped with lightning. He found him not in the center of a ceremony but in a smaller tent where an artisan was inlaying a breastplate with scenes of the fight. Lines of enamel and delicate filigree told the story of the siege, and in the very heart of the piece the artist had placed a small panel depicting the lyre blade. The image was gilded and placed like an offering. "Enough," Ferrus said, his voice low and iron. "You have begun to make a shrine of carnage." Fulgrim looked up. He did not flinch. The artisan's hand stilled, as if waiting on the edge of a breath. "We memorialize," Fulgrim replied. "We give history a form the mind can bear." Ferrus spat the word like a stone. "You make a spectacle of suffering. You humiliate the defeated as if they were models. Where is honor in that?" Fulgrim's face darkened. For a moment he looked older than Ferrus had ever seen him, not a primarch on a dais but a man whose reflection had been long in a poison pool. "Honor," he said slowly, "is subjective. You hold to old measures while the world changes. Perhaps it is you who cannot see that we are crafting something new." "You speak of craft and wear the blood of men like a garland," Ferrus answered. Fulgrim rose then, the lyre's hilt gripping his hand like a question. "You distrust what you do not understand," he said. "You distrust beauty because it is unfamiliar to your logic. You fear that the world will forget iron and remember only marble." Ferrus's fist closed. He felt the heat of rage not as a blade but as an old, familiar temper that came when principles were challenged. "Do not mistake my restraint for fear," he told his brother. "I will not stand by while zeal becomes idolatry. If the lyre is as dangerous as you suggest it reveals, then you must set it aside. You must not make your legion into an altar for it." Fulgrim's laugh had a jagged edge. "You would seize it from me?" "I would remove the hazard," Ferrus said. "If you cannot temper your will to the common good, then you will break me?" Fulgrim finished, not as a question but as a prophecy. "You will endanger men," Ferrus answered. "I will not be complicit." There was a pause long enough that the lantern in the tent had time to gutter. The artisan left, his work abandoned in mid-inlay. When he went, the silence that remained was not empty but full of something like the space before a clockwork returns to motion. Fulgrim reached down and took the blade from his belt. He held it out between them like a bar of accusation. The metal drank the lantern's light as if it were thirsting. "You ask me to become smaller than I am willing to be," he said. "You ask me to hand you the parts of me that make me who I am. The parts that endanger your legion, yes," Ferrus said. "For what purpose? To preserve a model of the past, Ferrus? To keep us safe from innovation?" Fulgrim's voice was sharp, as if his diatribe were tempered steel. "I will not be constrained by your fear." Ferrus could have struck there, could have seized the blade by force and cast it away in the night. He did not. His hand hovered near Forgebreaker, the promise of force heavy in his gauntlet. It would have been lawful to act, he was a primarch and had the authority to take measures. But violence between brothers carried a gravity that was different from battlefield enmity. It was a rupture that would not be healed by victory. He knew then that if he struck Fulgrim in anger he would become the very thing he feared, a man who crushed rather than reasoned. "I do not wish to break you," Ferrus said. "But if you will not lay it aside, I will not ignore it." Fulgrim's eyes softened then, and for a flicker Ferrus saw the brother of the Forges, the same one who had once laced his fingers in forged metal and smiled at the beauty of a clean edge. The moment of softness broke like glass. Fulgrim replaced the blade at his side and let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "Then watch me," he murmured. Watch and learn. Perhaps in time you will see what I see. He walked away, the tent flap closing behind him like a curtain falling on a scene. Ferrus remained, anchored to the spot by the weight of the decision he had just made, that he would watch. Not because passivity was his desire, but because he believed something rarer than immediate action. He believed that truth could sometimes be found in patience, in the gathering of evidence, in the hard tallying of cause and consequence. He would not act rashly and hand the story to rumor. He would instead gather and measure like a smith inspecting a seam. But observation is itself a choice, and sometimes the act of watching becomes complicity. Ferrus felt the discomfort of that truth sit in his chest. He had seen the liar's shadow cross the faces of men in Fulgrim's inner circle, he had seen the change in tactics, the theatrical cruelty that had slipped from a taste for expression into a habit of destruction. He had seen Fulgrim's laughter when he recited lines that valorized the blade itself. Each sight added a weight to the ledger in Ferrus's mind until the balance tipped. The decision he reached at the end of that night was not an idle thing. It was a pivot of spirit. He would confront Fulgrim in earnest when the time came when proof lay obvious like a broken bone. He would not be content with suspicion. He would seek confrontation only when action could be surgical and necessary and not simply an expression of wounded pride. That was the discipline Ferrus had forged within himself, the capacity to wield judgment like a calibrated instrument, not like a cudgel. And yet when, in the weeks that followed, Fulgrim began to call his captains and whisper into the ears of poets and artisans, when new symbols, mirrors, coils of silver, appeared among his men and when the liar's presence felt less like a curiosity and more like a ruling principle, Ferrus felt the pressure of inevitability. The month closed on a night of revelry in which Fulgrim performed a ceremony where he publicly unsheathed the lyre, held it high like a chalice, and spoke of transcendence. The words he spoke were honeyed and dangerous, promising a future where art and war were fused and where those who sought perfection would be elevated. Ferrus watched from the edge of that assembly and felt, for the first time, the cold clarity of a path he could no longer avoid. He had always measured strength by the integrity of his hands. Now he measured it by the integrity of his soul. The lyre blade had become both a symbol and a contagion. It stood between two brothers not as a mere object but as the inflection point of an era. Fulgrim had chosen his line, Ferrus had his. When the ceremony ended, Ferrus sought Fulgrim out not as a man who would gather more evidence but as one who intended to speak plainly. The moment of confrontation was not born of melodrama, it was the natural leveling of arithmetic that long patience sometimes produces. He found Fulgrim surrounded by admirers, but where once they had been enough to shield him, now their faces looked less like armor and more like glass, fragile and reflective. Enough, Ferrus said again, but this time the word carried the weight of a law invoked. You must lay it aside. Fulgrim's smile was tired and triumphant at once. You speak like a man who fears something he cannot see, he said. You will use force, perhaps. You will marshal the iron hands and you will declare your righteousness. But know this, truth can be an uncomfortable thing. It will make you small. Ferrus's reply was no longer a patient instrument. Then I will be small rather than risk my men to the contagion of vanity. Fulgrim's eyes flashed with a light that was not entirely his own. So be it, brother. Let us see whose truth will endure. When Ferrus left, the decision had crystallized into a terrible clarity. The confrontation he sought would not be a quiet admonishment. It would be a rupture. The choice to act, once made, cannot be unmade. He felt it as a heat that leached away the last of his leisure to hope that this would pass. The way forward, he now knew, required more than words. The next dawn Ferrus called his captains. The words he issued were not many, but they were precise. He would confront Fulgrim. If his brother rejected counsel, he would remove the lyre by whatever lawful means were necessary to preserve the legion and the men under their charge. He did not relish it. He had not come into being to shatter the brotherhood that had raised him. But he had come into being to make hard choices, to tip the scales when imbalance threatened to become ruin. So he prepared. He forged the discipline of his will into a weapon that had nothing to do with Forgebreaker's head or weight, it was a resolve cold and clean. This was not a prelude to war but an inflection toward it. The fall into chaos had turned from a whisper into a visible tilt, and Ferris, standing beneath the grey sky, felt the first true tremor of what that tilt might cost. He would not let it alone any longer. The air that morning tasted of copper and frost, as if the world itself had been tempered and then left to cool too quickly. Dawn came not as salvation but as an accusation, a cold, pale hand unmasking what the night had hidden. Ferris Manus woke with the weight of it in his ribs, an ache like a burr caught under skin, and knew before his feet touched the ground that the balance he had attempted to hold was breaking. He moved through the camp like a man following a map only he could read. Tents and banners, once a fabric of two legions stitched together by shared victories, now fluttered with divisions of design and devotion. Where the Emperor's children had once hung banners of crimson and white, Fulgrim's colors had been altered, subtle bands of silver, coils of mirrored thread, symbols that gleamed in ways Ferris could not call natural. Men who once wore their armor for protection now wore it as presentation, gilded edges, mirrored inlays, the rituals of appearance elevated above the blunt truth of defense. The Iron Hands' ranks were ordered and plain, their banners were iron gray, their talk of tactics and logistics. The contrast struck Ferris like a cold blade. He had not yet intended to confront Fulgrim that day. His plan had been a small calculus of pressure, observation, counsel, the presentation of hard facts so that reason might guide a brother back from a precipice. But the world, indifferent to plans, moved in other ways. Word came, someone's whisper that spiraled into a messenger that became a cluster of captains, of an assembly where Fulgrim would demonstrate a new doctrine. The term used by the Emperor's children carried a sheen that made Ferris' jaw tighten, transcendence. He followed without announcing himself. The plaza chosen for the assembly was the heart of a conquered world, a square of polished stone scarred by ruin, now newly tended. Mirrors had been arrayed there like 1,000 lakes. The artisans Fulgrim favored had strung them on frames, set them in columns, and in each reflection the light split and multiplied, fracturing the crowd into many faces. The people of the planet, once nameless rubble beneath war boots, had been given robes and posed at the edge of the spectacle to raise the price of the show. It was grotesque, suffering arranged into ornament. Ferris felt bile press against his throat. He watched from the edge. Fulgrim stood upon a dais, lit by columned braziers whose flames burned too clear, too blue. At his side was the lyre blade, sheathed in a scabbard that drank light like a holy relic. Around him, those who had come to admire, captains, poets, the curators, murmured as if in the presence of something revered. Their eyes shone with a devotion that had the texture of lust more than loyalty. There was a silence, then, that rose like a tide. Fulgrim spoke, and Ferris heard the cadence as he might listen to a song he had rejected long ago. Words fitted to charm, and yet there was malice in the way they smoothed over pain. "We are not here merely to conquer," Fulgrim said. "We are here to refine. The Imperium's work is not only to hold but to ennoble. The lyre will show us the form of truth, and from that form we will carve perfection." The crowd answered with a chorus that pleased Fulgrim like applause. Ferris felt anger harden along his backbone, not the thin, hot streak of immediate temper, but a slow, blunted anger like a press compressing metal. This was not a man urging restraint or counsel. It was a man enshrining an idol. When the demonstration began, it was the worst of Fulgrim's theatrical genius. He unsheathed the lyre and held it aloft. The blade reflected not the world but the desires that crouched within people's chests. In its mirror face, men saw themselves as greater, as entitled to reach and to remake. Where eyes met it, something softened or went sharp. Men were not merely impressed, they were coaxed. The lyre whispered, subtle at first, into tongues and thoughts, its influence like the first cold spot on a hand, the first numbness before a limb fails. A chosen few were brought forward, prisoners, captains accused of past cowardice, artisans who had never held power. They were forced to look into the blade's face. Each time, the blade turned their reflection into something beckoning, and something in them shifted. Ferris could not bear it. He moved toward the dais and his approach sent a ripple through the assembled forms. Fulgrim saw him and smiled with a public radiance that did not touch his eyes. "Brother," he said as Ferris neared, "come witness the birth of a new tempering. See how truth may be refined to reveal potential." Ferris did not answer with a smile. "Stop this." His voice carried like a hammer. "Do not use men as demonstrations. Lay aside the blade." Fulgrim's hand tightened on the lyre's hilt. For a heartbeat there was something like regret, then a flash of steel in his face as if some other light had cocked behind his pupils. "You speak as if you have authority to command my conscience, Ferris. Since when did the hammer presume to lecture the blade?" "You talk of conscience and call it craft," Ferris said. "You call truth a blade and brand men with it. I will not be party to this." The crowd hissed like a wounded animal, some shifted and murmured in alarm. Fulgrim lifted the lyre, and the murmurs hushed as if music had started. He turned to the nearest captive, a young officer whose eyes still held defiance, and pressed the mirror edge to his breastplate. "Look," Fulgrim told him. "See what you might be without the chains of fear." The captive knelt. He looked into the blade. For a second his face was transformed, his lips smiled as if he had been shown a mercy. Then he laughed, a high, wet sound, and rose not with newfound courage but with a crazed fervor. He grabbed a spear from a retainer and in a moment had slaughtered the nearest groom and then struck out at his own captors. Panic spread. Men who had stood with Fulgrim's smile now found themselves with blood on their hands. The lyre had turned a controlled demonstration into a catalyst. Fear, once managed, had combusted into frenzy. Ferris acted with the immediacy of a man with iron in his limbs. He struck, his gauntlet fist catching the officer across the jaw and sending him collapsing like an undone puppet. In the chaos a blade flashed and a poet, a man whose lyrics had always been flattering, threw himself into the press in a fever of adoring violence. The plaza became a theater of sudden brutality and control shifting into unique, jagged shapes. Ferris fought to restrain, to hold lines, to pin the explosion into a digestible moment. But the contagion had already touched too many. When the smoke thinned, the plaza lay in broken silence. Bodies, some of them soldiers, some cult artisans, littered the stone. The mirrors were shattered, their fragments a glittering carpet like scattered stars. The crowd had thinned into a knot of loyalists, and among them, some faces were different, converts, or men whose eyes had been altered by the blade's reflection. Fulgrim stood with blood flecked upon his cuirass, the lyre sheathed at his side as if it had merely been an instrument of study. He looked at Ferris not with regret but with an expression that was both proud and something cruelly intimate. "You see," Fulgrim said, as if lecturing a student, "this is the raw material. We have seen the potential. Let us not be fools who refuse to temper what might be perfected." Ferris felt betrayal like a physical impact, a pressure that buckled the world. He had expected theater, perhaps blunted cruelty, but not this. Not the corruption writ across his brother's face, not the relish in that face as men were unmade and then made anew into something else. The blade, the lyre, had done more than twist courage into mania, it had altered something in Fulgrim that Ferris had not noticed until that moment, the absence of a boundary. He remembered then the quiet workshop of their youth, when Fulgrim had handled a whetstone with devotion and Ferris had swung Forgebreaker with gratitude for its function. He flung the image back at the present and found it raw, insufficient. There were no small slippages now. The lyre was not merely a toy or a fetish, it had become a vector. And Fulgrim had allowed it to teach him new truths, truths that changed the nature of his mercy into something predatory. A congress of captains came hastily to the center then, iron hands stern and unforgiving, emperor's children flushed with excitement and a strange zealot's calm. Ferris spoke plainly, the blade must be taken, the rituals ended, the captains who had been corrupted must be punished. He expected Fulgrim to listen. He expected, because he wanted to believe, that blood ties would hold. Fulgrim's reply was not what he expected. "You would seize my symbol?" he asked, each syllable a refinement. You would reject the possibility of transforming weakness into perfection because you are frightened by what you cannot command. Ferrus felt his control narrow into a line. I would seize a hazard that kills men by turning their hearts into instruments. I would preserve our legion from contamination. Fulgrim laughed then, a sound not of mirth but of triumph. Legions are living things, Ferrus. They change. They must be wrenched into new forms. You would cling to what is safe and call it virtue. I call it stagnation. The captains muttered. Some, those who had tasted the blade's promise, shifted toward Fulgrim as if gravity had reversed. The schism that had been a hairline crack now spidered through the tented command. A captain, once close to Ferrus, stepped away and caught Fulgrim's hand in an embrace that had the temperature of covenant. Words like allegiance and fidelity were exchanged in whispers. Ferrus realized then that this was not merely a disagreement between brothers, it was a fracture that would cleave armies. Men he had trusted with his forces were looking to Fulgrim for a new gospel. He moved to seize the lyre. Fulgrim drew back with an elegance that was almost graceful, and the blade came free with a whisper. In that split second as Fulgrim raised it, something in him changed utterly. The eyes that met Ferrus were not merely cocky or self-assured, they were bright with a crucible flame, a rapture. He spoke then, not to reason but to a deeper voice. If you would take it, then you must take me too. The words were a hinge. What followed was not a negotiation but a declaration. Fulgrim stepped forward with a motion like a blade being drawn, and his captains moved as instruments already trained. Some shouted, others slashed. The plaza became an arena. Steel sang. Forgebreaker rose and fell with a righteous rhythm. Ferrus did not wish for the blood spilled, but he knew how to end men without sentiment. He had pounded enemies into silence for decades, cold removal was a craft he had honed. Yet as he parried and struck, as his hammer met the will of men who had once been his brothers in arms, a different violence gnawed at him, the rupture within his heart. Fulgrim did not merely fight as a commander. He fought like a revelation. His blade cut with a light that sliced both flesh and memory. Every time Ferrus struck the Primarch, he felt not only the resistance of steel on steel but the erosion of trust. The spectacle of their duel drew the eyes of the gathered, even captains from other legions watched with a horrified, vicarious awe. Ferrus's blows were measured, he would strike to disable, to end threats without making martyrdom of his kin. Fulgrim struck like a man unburdened by mercy, each stroke an argument that Ferrus's restraint was a flaw. At one point Fulgrim feinted and drove the lyre low. The tip found a gap in Ferrus's pauldron and sank with a sound like a blown bell. Pain flared, clean and blinding, blood hot and metallic against his gums. The world narrowed and a voice inside him, older than the man, older than war, said, almost purely, betrayal. He tasted something even stranger before his knee hit the marble, a memory of a younger Fulgrim smiling across a forge, hair matted with soot, hands as capable as any artist's, a memory of him offering a whetstone as if offering the world a piece of himself. That Fulgrim looked at him then not with the thrill of mutilation but with warmth. The memory ruptured into the present and Ferrus felt grief so sharp that it steadied his hammer. He rose and struck back, not with blind fury but with the clarity of someone defending a truth. There is a kind of sorrow in righteous violence, it is not the violence of revenge but the violence of a surgeon cleansing rot. Ferrus fought convinced of two things at once, that he must stop this man, and that the man he fought was still, in some worn place, his brother. The battle swelled into a cacophony of cries, metal and pain. Somewhere a banner fell. The ground underfoot slicked with a sheen of oil and blood. Ferrus' arms ached, his breath came in strained pulls, but he continued, because stopping would have meant letting the contagion spread without boundary. He sought to fight not to kill for the sake of vengeance but to remove a danger. Every strike he made was accompanied by a lament. At last Fulgrim stepped back. Their blades were crossed in a lattice of sparks and grief. For a moment the two Primarchs hovered there, the spectacle of their duel carved into the air. Fulgrim's chest rose and fell like a bellows, his face streaked with tears he would not name. Ferrus looked into those eyes and saw, not the son of Terra he had known but, something else, bright and terrible, an idolized being that had accepted a bargain. "You have fallen," Ferrus said, the words a quiet accusation. "There is darkness in you that is not mine." Fulgrim laughed, and the laugh held both sorrow and triumph. "And you would lecture me on falling? Brother, you do not understand. This is not merely darkness, it is form. It is the sharpening of a will that will not be content with mediocrity. We will remake the galaxy in a more honest image." Ferrus felt hatred rise, quick, hot, and with it the ancient, older love that twined with it like vines around iron. He realized that he was being asked to do something unthinkable, to cut down the man who had once shared his hammer. He understood, bleakly, that words were spent, reason had been swallowed by the liar's reflection and by a hunger more ancient than either of them. Fulgrim attacked then, not as a man seeking to kill outright but to prove a point. The liar moved with uncanny speed and a cruelty sharpened by madness. Ferrus parried and answered. The ring of their clash was a sound that would settle into his memory as an ache, like a note struck under water that never quite dissolves. With each blow Ferrus felt his world alter, comrade to enemy, brother turned threshold. When the fighting finally ebbed, the plaza was a ruin of purpose. Fulgrim, blood-smeared and unbowed, had rallied those who chose him. Ferrus, wounded and weary, found his iron hands around him, their faces set like the metal they so cherished. A dozen loyal captains knelt, holding broken limbs and shields. He had not thought that the betrayal could cut deeper than any weapon, but as he sat, blood soaking the folds of his banner, he understood that there are wounds invisible to armor. The worst cut was not across muscle or bone but across the ledger of trust. He had believed in a brother, and the ledger had been falsified. The weight of that falseness pressed down like a yoke. He tried then to name his feelings, grief, anger, sorrow, a cold lucidity that made the world look spare and harsh. He had always believed that loyalty was a currency to be spent with care. He had never considered how it might be counterfeit. The men who had followed him, who remained with him, looked not at Fulgrim's glimmering pageants but at the simple, steel truth of their Primarch's words. They had not been seduced by mirrors. They had not taken the liar's reflection. Their faces steadied him like anvils. Ferrus stood, grasping Forgebreaker with a hand that trembled more from the weight of revelation than from injury. He walked through the shattered mirror scrub and felt the air sting his lungs. Every shard reflected a moment of their shared past differently, some showed them laughing at a forge, others contorted with rage, others blank and meaningless like facades. He looked up and saw Fulgrim across the plaza, his silhouette cut against a sky smeared with smoke. For a second the man he had once loved seemed like a figure in a tomb, both present and unreachable. He did not yet strike the final blow. That was not his choice to make. There were laws, and there were men to gather, and there was the slow calculus of judgment. But Fulgrim had marked himself, had chosen an axis that rejected the iron law Ferrus lived by. The rift was made and, Ferrus knew as surely as he knew the temper of his hammer, it would not be mended by words. Later that night, in a tent that smelled of oil and metal, Ferrus bared his wound to a trusted captain. The pain was clean and hot and the medicine would bind it, but what he could not bind was the bruise in his chest. He spoke then of loyalty, not as an abstraction but as a living covenant. He spoke of how it had been betrayed, not by an enemy, but by the man whose laughter had once steadied his hands. The captain listened and did not answer until Ferrus had finished. When the reply came it was not sentimental but absolute. "We stand with you, Primarch," the captain said. "We stand on iron, not reflection. We will carry the weight." Ferrus nodded, the gesture weary and grateful. This was his discipline, to accept the burden of choice and to carry it like an anvil. The betrayal would not free him from duty. If anything, it hardened him. He would not allow the contagion to spread. He would take measures, surgical if he could, brutal if he must. But he also felt something else, a quieter, more terrible thing, the knowledge that the enemy he faced wore a face he had loved. As the embers cooled, Ferrus Manus sat and steeled himself for what must come. The betrayal had torn a clean line through his life and placed him on the far side of a gulf. He would not be the first to bleed for a cause he believed in, he would also not be the last to watch a brother fall. The night closed like a lid on a box that held both grief and resolve. Ferrus felt both, and neither yielded to the other. He would prepare for the storm he had tried so long to avert. He would confront Fulgrim when the moment demanded force. He would seek not only the removal of a blade but the preservation of men's souls. Outside, under mirrors shattered and banners torn, the empire of two brothers split into factions and the first true steps toward a war darker than either had imagined were taken. Ferrus, hand over wounded ribs and eyes rimmed with both sleep and sorrow, looked into the blackness and vowed, quietly, without flourish, that he would not let the betrayal stand unpunished. The morning air tasted of iron and old prayers, as if the sky itself had been hammered and left to cool too quickly. Dawn bled through torn clouds in thin, cold shafts that pierced the smoke, they struck the ruined skyline like the blades of 1,000 small judgments. Ferrus Manus moved through the camp with the slow certainty of one who has already measured his steps against fate. He felt the weight of the day like a gauntlet fitted to his hand, not merely the burden of command, but the particular gravity of a betrayal that had split flesh and memory. The two legions occupied opposite flanks of a valley that had known better destinies. Once it had been a place of harvest, now it was a testbed for inevitability. The Emperor's children had arranged their banners and panels like an art installation, shards of mirrored steel catching the dawn and multiplying the image of their primarch into many shining ghosts. The Iron Hands stood more practical and severe, their banners were iron gray, each fold plain and uncompromising. The contrast was a map of the rift itself. Ferrus sat alone a little while before the muster, in a ruined watchtower that leaned like a tired sentinel. He let his fingers close around Forgebreaker's haft until the familiarity steadied him. The hammer was not merely a weapon but an anchor, metal and design that responded the way his hands expected. He reflected on the sequence of choices that had led them here. He could still remember the laughter in the forge on Terra, metal singing on metal and youth making friends of fire and anvil. He could remember Fulgrim's hands, precise, patient, coaxing the fire blade until the edge sang. Those memories had been the covenant, now they were relics preserved under glass. He thought of 1,000 small offenses that had grown into treason, the first mirrored panel, the first staged sermon, the first time the liar's reflection had shifted a man's expression into mania. He tried to catalogue the moment of desertion, not only when Fulgrim unsheathed the lyre in public, not only when captains abandoned their posts for an aesthetic promise, but when the man he called brother stopped seeing soldiers as men and began seeing them as canvases. He had sworn, once, to make a choice guided by the steel of reason. Today would be such a day. He would not act out of revenge. He would act because the cost of allowing the contagion to spread would be measured in lives. He would not be, he told himself, a judge moved by personal wound, he would be a commander guided by the cold calculus of duty. Yet in the quiet before battle his chest ached with a grief that had nothing to do with tactics. It was the ache of a man who had loved and been betrayed, a faith had been broken in the naked way faith sometimes is, sudden, implosive, and irreparable. He closed his eyes and remembered the whetstone, the laughter, the nights they had shared stories and plans as if the galaxy could be bent by their hands. That Ferrus understood, more than anything, was that betrayal is not a single act but a pivot, the world shifts around it and never quite fits again. The field that had been chosen for the confrontation was a battleground of symbolism, an old fortress whose battlements rose like the teeth of a broken saw. Fulgrim's forces had taken the outer works and made the parapets into galleries, statues with mirrored faces and woven silver had been erected like altars. The lyre was displayed at the highest point, unsheathed and mounted as if it were a sundial. Around it the Emperor's children had arranged their formations not as shields but as a stage. Ferrus's iron hands advanced in measured ranks, each man a moving anvil. When the two armies met the sound was not the old kind of thunder. This was the noise of two philosophies colliding, iron upon mirrored light. Cannon thundered, close and abrasive, but the real shock began when Fulgrim stepped into the open and called for the duel that would decide what remainder of unity remained between them. His visage was both radiant and terrible. There was a certain magnetism about him now that Ferrus had never seen. The liar's influence, whether through artifact or the men around him, had sharpened him into a figure of myth. The fireblade hung at his hip like a promise, his armor gleamed as if polished by the light of a dozen suns. His smile was the old smile and also a new, inflected thing, an invitation and a final dismissal in the same movement. "Brother," Fulgrim said, his voice carrying over the valley, "this need not end in ruin. If you would persevere, then come and prove to me that iron and fire can make a single instrument." There was a hollow generosity in the words that Ferrus could not accept. It was like being offered a cordial by a man holding poison. Ferrus's reply was a narrow thing. "There is no unity with a blade that makes monsters of men." Fulgrim's face clouded and then cleared like a stage light sweep. "There are worse foundations, Ferrus. There are hypocrisies wrapped in old banners. But I would bind no man to the past for its own sake." Ferrus felt the world tilt as if in response. A drum of artillery rolled like distant thunder, and then the first movement of engagement began. The first clash was not between the Primarchs but between the lines, pistons of iron and caught gilded wings. The Emperor's children advanced with flaring theatrics, columns flowed like dancers, their spears raised in elegant arcs. The iron hands met them with blunt, efficient violence, bolters spat, hammerheads fell, and the ground surrendered in patches under the pressure. The battle was a choreography of contrast. Ferrus moved through it like a shadow, decisive, blunt, effective. He watched Fulgrim not only as a general but as a study in corrupted artistry. The Primarch fought close to the front, engaging enemy squads with an intimacy that made Ferrus cold. There was a new savor in Fulgrim's blows. He did not simply cut, he composed. Men who had thought themselves beyond display found their deaths rendered into lessons about form. Ferrus saw captains rearranged as portraiture, faces turned outward toward an audience mid-strike. The liar's influence bred not only cruelty but an aesthetic of cruelty, and the sight of it steeled Ferrus's resolve. At last the two leaders moved toward each other, inevitable like two tides. The ground between them was strewn with bodies that no longer resembled men in the way Ferrus had once understood. He felt, briefly, the elemental need to end this. Not to punish, but to sever. He had already decided long ago that if Fulgrim would not lay down the blade, then the blade must be taken. They met in the middle of the breach, where the marble had been cracked into a jagged, blackened scar. The world narrowed to the weight of two breathing bodies and the sound of steel on steel. Fulgrim's strikes were beautiful, they were a language Ferrus once admired before he learned it could lie. He moved like a conductor, and each stroke had the air of performance rather than desperation. Ferrus answered in blunt cadences, hammer arcs that sought to break rather than please. The two styles collided and sparks leapt, literal sparks in the dew, but also sparks of memory. Between blows Ferrus watched for a tell, a slackening of purpose, the flash of older sympathies. He found none. Where he most hoped to recognize the boy who had once shared his bench, he saw only a man who had embraced a new gospel. And yet there were moments, small fractures, when doubt flickered in Fulgrim's face. In a lull between assaults, Ferrus caught him looking, not at the crowd, not at the blade, but at the little whetstone that had been bound into the fireblade's hilt long ago. For a fraction of a breath, the Primarch's expression softened with the ache of memory, a whetstone and laughter, a furnace and the smell of molten ore. He raised an arm and faltered, just enough that Ferrus's hammer found a glancing blow upon his shoulder, and Fulgrim rebalanced with a grimace that looked like a man swallowing regret. That hesitation was a small and nagging thing, like a seam that threatened to come undone. Ferrus registered it and for an instant felt the older love temper his strike. He wondered then if the core of Fulgrim could still be wrenched back into the world. But the thought dissolved against the reality of the liar's heat. The Primarch's recovery was quick and the rapture returned to his eyes like a bright infection. The pause had been the shadow of doubt, but it had not endured. They traded words then with the violence of men who had exhausted politeness. You would make gods of our soldiers, Ferrus said between blows. You would hollow them of agency. You would keep them like tools, Fulgrim answered. Better slaves of habit than artisans of destiny. You ask them to be sculptures of your vanity. Fulgrim's expression folded into a complexity Ferrus had rarely seen. For a fraction more than a second, there was an almost humane awful hesitation, a sliver of self-examination. He swallowed, and his lips parted not in rhetoric but in a raw and private sound, like one admitting to a private wound. Ferrus saw then the shape of the man beneath the priestly robes, not merely the idol he had become but a being capable of doubt, of recollection, of remorse. It unsettled Ferrus as deeply as any blade. For a heartbeat he envied the possibility of redemption, he imagined they might stand down and let the world find a way to stitch the torn seam. But the moment was brief and fragile. Fulgrim fixed his gaze and with a motion that had the decisiveness of ritual, he seized the lyre and slammed it against his palm as a man might press a flame to his own skin to prove a point to himself. The impact of that gesture was like iron on bone. Ferrus felt the inevitability of end. He knew that Fulgrim's hesitation had been real, that within him flickered a humanism that could have saved him. But he also knew the lyre's corruption had not been a single infection but a cancer, it had eaten through choice and then regrew. His brother had chosen the poison, in choosing it he completed a divorce with the principles that once bound them. The duel reached its zenith like the shattering of a great bell. Fulgrim moved with the grace of a sculptor and the rage of a prophet. Ferrus answered with measured, weary force. The ground around them became a ring of broken oaths, men watched and felt the history of their own hearts rearrange. Then the moment came that would not be unmade. Fulgrim feinted low and drove high, the lyre's tip slipped beneath a joint and sank into Ferrus's armor. The pain was a white flare through his senses. For a breath Ferrus's world narrowed to a point of red, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. Pain did not diminish his clarity. On the contrary, it made his remembrance sharp, he saw the arc of his life, forged sparks, laughter, toil, the faces of men who had given their lives to the cause. When he could stand, Ferrus struck true. Forgebreaker crashed in a sweep that would have shattered most bones. It hit Fulgrim's guard and sent the Primarch staggering. For a moment Ferrus believed with an ugly, aching hope that the blow would break the other man's will. Instead, Fulgrim's eyes flared not with vulnerability but with an almost ecstatic resolution. He laughed, a sound like a broken bell, and then with the lyre's whisper he dealt a strike that found a gap and wounded Ferrus across the chest. Blood ran free, warm and hot against the cold morning. The wound was deep, and it cut cleanly enough to be a sentence. Ferrus felt it as a release, as if some pressure valve had let go inside him. Pain and freedom mingled into a composure that felt like the end of a long forging. He thought of his warriors, the Iron Hands, who had stood through generations without falter. He thought of the men who still looked to him and the trust that had once cemented brotherhood. He did not blame Fulgrim for the blow in any simple way, he felt only the crushing sorrow of a covenant rent. The battlefield closed around them in a haze. Voices rose and fell like wind. Men who had once taken camps in unison now stood divided like knotted wood. Ferrus fell to one knee. The world narrowed into a bright, static focus on Fulgrim's face. He could see the other man, his brother, clearly now, not as a myth but as a man bent by choices. He saw the lyre at the Primarch's side, black and small but potent as a seed. He felt the life bleeding outward and with a clarity unmarred by pain he understood the shape of things, betrayals could not be undone by strength alone, some lines, once crossed, remained. Fulgrim closed upon him, not merciless but resolved. He lifted the lyre, and for a fraction of a breath Ferrus saw something like regret cross the Primarch's features. It was barely more than a wrinkle, an involuntary acknowledgement of what he was about to do. In that sliver, Ferrus' heart bent with a terrible tenderness. He would not weep. Tears are water in a forge, they cool and ruin the temper. But his mouth formed words anyway. Fulgrim, he said, the syllables heavy with memory, I forged with you. We bent steel together. Fulgrim's hand trembled. The blade hovered. For a moment, time stuttered as if listening for what would come. The Primarch's hesitation was a raw and human thing, it showed that even at the edge of ruin, choice remained for a flicker. He lowered the lyre and met Ferris's gaze. "I remember," Fulgrim said, low, and then his voice changed as if the lyre had a tongue in his throat. "But the world has no patience for old iron." Ferris smiled, a small, exhausted curl of his mouth. "Then make room for it in your hands. Make room for the men who hold it." Fulgrim's face contorted with an emotion that mixed rage, pity, and something like sorrow. He lifted the blade with both hands and drove it down. The impact was final and breathtaking. It was not a quick thing, death rarely is in the way that men imagine, but it was decisive. Ferris felt the world go wide and then narrow to a single point of heat. He thought, strangely, of the whetstone again, of the boy who had presented it like a friend's gift. He thought of the smell of forge fire and the laughter that had made them brothers. He also thought of duty, of men who stood because he had chosen for them. When he died, it was not with a triumphant roar or a bitter curse. It was with a stillness like a struck anvil cooling. His fingers loosened around forgebreaker and the hammer clattered onto stone. Somewhere in the distance a bell tolled once, and the sound sailed across the field like a small, honest note. Fulgrim remained standing, the lyre slick and small in his hands. For a long moment he did not move. The riot of battle continued around him, but his attention folded inward, like a man closing a wound and then finding no skin left to stitch it. The hesitation that had pierced his heart in the lull of the duel returned, but this time it was a hollow that could not be filled. He stared at the body of the man who had been his brother and felt a rupture unfamiliar and raw. Around him men cheered, some for victory, some for the promise of a new order. Many wept. Some knelt as if in prayer. But the sound of Fulgrim's captains, of those who had sung his name and followed the lyre's reflection into fever, sounded both triumphal and empty. The transformation he had sought had been purchased with a price that not even he had fully calculated. In the hush that followed, Fulgrim reached down and took Ferris's helm in his hands. He lifted it as if to place it upon his own head and then set it aside, lowering his face to the fallen man's forehead. For a moment, not staged, not performative, he closed his eyes and the expression on his face was less the sculpted pride it had become than the look of a man who has realized the terrible shape of his appetite. Regret is not always a single, clean thing. It can be a melange of bitter pleasures, remembered joys, and the recognition of squandered futures. Fulgrim's regret tasted like iron and wine. He felt the weight of what he had done, that in seizing a new form for men, he had unmade a brother. The lyre's whisper, which had once sung like sweet music to him, now sounded strangely thin. He had not expected to feel this way, not in the violent, immediate sense of personal loss. He had thought in those fevered moments of art and transcendence that any cost borne would be justified by the perfection it promised. But standing over the body of Ferris Manus, he felt, suddenly and absolutely, how thin the promise was next to the warm solidity of a life. The men who had cheered at his ascent had turned mortal and fallible at the sight of blood, some ran from the field, others knelt and wept. The aftermath unfolded like a play in which the actors had lost their lines. Some of Fulgrim's captains tried to fashion meaning from the event, calling it a necessary sacrifice that would birth a new era. Others, who had not tasted the lyre's bright fruit, stared at the Primarch with thin, distrustful eyes. In the Iron Hands camp there was silence and steadiness. Men tended wounds, buried the dead, and in quiet ways reaffirmed those things that had always bound them, duty, craftsmanship, service. For Fulgrim the world narrowed to the shape of a helmet and the texture of blood on hands. He had wanted to elevate men, instead he had remade himself as an architect of ruin. The lyre lay at his side like a black stone. The cost of transcendence sat heavy in his chest as an ache that no aesthetic could soothe. He tried, in the nights that followed, to convince himself that the end had been necessary. He wrote manifestos in a distorted hand, plastered proclamations that spoke of renewal and perfection. He ordered memorials and plays to catalogue the moment as a sacrament. He surrounded himself with art and curators and mirrors that promised to show what he had sacrificed. But when he found himself alone, the mirror offered not solace but only the reflection of a man who had crossed a limit from which there is no return. In the Iron Hands camp, the death of Fabius Manus became a crucible. Men who had followed him did not collapse, they hardened like steel tempered in cold water. They spoke quietly in the forges and in the dimness of tents, and their resolve had a tone of finality. Where Fulgrim had sought to craft his own image, Fabius's men built memorials of a different kind, stores to bind the weak, rearmament for the broken, the simple algebra of survival. The ripples spread beyond the valley. News travels like fire in dry fields, and soon legions that had been allied stood on wary ground. The emperor's court would hear of it, they would weigh responses and issue commands. But whatever decrees fell like edicts in the days to come, the immediate truth was raw and unrepairable: two brothers had been sundered and the galaxy would be poorer for the breach. Months afterward, Fulgrim would walk through halls of tribute to his new vision and find they did not satisfy. He would study the faces of the men who followed him and find their new, fragile fissures. In moments he would feel a phantom pressure where Fabius had stood beside him. In quiet times the memory of the whetstone would return like a small, steady regret. He would sometimes take up the fire blade and press its edge to a whetstone as if preparing for a task that had become impossible to complete. The act would not bring back Fabius, it would only remind him that the man he had loved had been real and that the choice to cut him down was irreversible. In the Iron Hands forges, the men sang no odes to martyrdom. They sang the old songs of labor and returning to the work of holding. They polished helmets and tuned bolters, took stock of losses and reallocated what resources remained. There was sorrow, a deep, cold sorrow that tasted like metal, but in its place a stubborn fidelity took root. They would not let the contagion of the liar spread. They had a primarch whose last command had been to guard what was true and hard and useful. They would do so with the quiet terror of survivors. The empire of two brothers had fractured into separate empires, each bearing the imprint of its creator. Where Fulgrim had sought to refashion the soul of men, Fabius's legacy lay in the simple honesty of service. The war between them would grow, as wars do, it would bend worlds and crush cities. But the day that Fabius died would remain the heart of that conflict, a moment in which the world watched as loyalty split like a brittle seam. Years later, when historians, if historians could be found with the courage to speak plainly, wrote of the time, they would mark the day not merely as a tactical loss but as an ethical fracture. They would ask what value lies in beauty when it drowns the human voice. They would ask whether transcendence that devours those it would refine is a virtue at all. Fulgrim's corruption would be used as a caution and a seduction in equal measure. A new generation would look upon his art and feel its magnetism, another would look and see only the blood beneath the lacquer. Fabius's men would teach their successors to temper iron as if temper of soul and to judge the character of a man by the steadiness of his hand. In the quiet that follows every great storm, there is a long season in which the world learns to remember. For some this memory is a poem, for others it is a ledger. For Fabius Manus, the ledger would contain the simple line of a life given in defense of men. For Fulgrim, the memory would be a mirror in which he would see his own face forever altered. Brotherhood, once a thing bound by laughter and the furnace, had been broken by a choice made in the name of perfection. Loyalty had been tested to its limits and found that it could be transmuted into idolatry. In the end the moral was not one of clean triumph, it was a lament for the cost of a man's hunger to be more than he was, and for the ruin left in the wake of that hunger. The field cooled. Time, which is patient and indifferent, began to heal the edges of the wound. But certain scars remained bright enough to be read like a map, and the name of Fabius Manus would be one such landmark, both a warning and a standard. Men would tell the tale in the forges and the barracks and the quiet moments before battle. They would speak of a primarch who had loved a brother and been betrayed, and of a brother who had sought a form of perfection and lost himself in the reaching. When the last embers had long since died, when banners had been replaced and new campaigns carved fresh scars into the galaxy, the memory of that valley would linger, a tarnished mirror, a cold hammer, a whetstone and the taste of iron on the tongue. It would not be the only story of the age, nor the cleanest. But it would be the story of two brothers who had risen together and then, by the arch of choice and the bite of a blade, been sundered, one to die with the quiet dignity of a smith, the other to live on in the glow of a terrible, unredeemed brilliance.